He found a dying creature deep in the forest. Its last words were not a warning, they were much more terrifying. Subscribe and write in the comments which country you are watching from. The morning began like so many others in the remote corners of northern Oregon, quiet enough to make a man believe the world had forgotten him. Dawn had not yet broken when Jack Morris awoke in his small ranger cabin, the faint blue of early light spreading across the single-room space like a thin veil. He lay still for a few moments, staring at the ceiling's wooden boards, listening to the muffled silence outside. The forest could be loud in its own way, branches creaking under wind, distant water rushing, the chatter of morning birds. But today, something in that silence felt different. Not threatening, not even ominous, just thick enough that it seemed the trees themselves held their breath. Jack pushed himself upright, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The same ritual played out every morning, a moment of waking confusion, a moment of remembering, and finally the slow rise into the day's demands. He dressed in his ranger uniform, though here no one ever checked if it was pristine. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and old coffee, a scent he had come to associate with being alive and separate from everything he once was. Life as a forest ranger had become a kind of refuge for Jack. After leaving the military, abruptly, painfully, he needed a place where words were optional and silence did not require explanation. The forest offered that. Trees did not ask why he sometimes woke drenched in sweat. Deer did not care about the young soldier he had failed to pull from the rubble. The wind did not question the way he flinched at sudden sounds. Here, he could simply be another creature trying to survive. He stepped outside and inhaled the cold morning air. A faint mist hovered low, clinging to the undergrowth as if reluctant to leave the earth. Jack picked up his pack, checked the gear by habit compass, water, first aid kit, radio, field notebook, and headed out. The sun had not yet risen above the dense canopy, but even without light, he knew every curve of the trail by memory. He had walked this path hundreds of times, each time hoping it would quiet his mind a little more. Yet today, the quiet felt different. The normal rhythm of the forest seemed muted. Not a single bird called out. No small creature rustled in the ferns. It wasn't unnatural silence, but intentional, as though everything waited for something Jack could not yet see. He tried brushing off the feeling. Nature had moods, just like people. But as he continued along the trail, the stillness followed him like a shadow he hadn't noticed until it stepped into the light. At a wooded bend near a small creek, something caught his eye. A disturbance in the damp earth. Jack crouched without thinking, his military instincts reacting faster than his conscious mind. It was a footprint, but unlike any he had seen before. Huge, 1/2 meter long, clearly defined, pressed deep into the mud by immense weight. 5 toes, human-like in shape, but far too large and too heavy. Jack traced the edges with his fingers. Not a hoax. It couldn't be. The depth of the print told him the creature weighed at least several hundred pounds. A man couldn't fake that. A bear couldn't make it either. Bears left claws, different patterns, different angles. This, whatever it was, walked upright. The silence of the forest pressed closer. Jack stood slowly, scanning the surroundings. The creek murmured gently, the only moving thing in the moment. His breath came out visible in the cold morning air. Instinct told him to walk away. Training, duty, and something deeper told him to follow. The prints led upstream, weaving through moss-covered stones and fallen logs. He noticed broken branches far above his head, snapped cleanly as if something tall had brushed through them. Here and there were smears of darkened blood, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Something was hurt. Badly. Jack felt the familiar shift inside his chest, the one that had carried him across battlefields, through smoke and fire, through nights lit only by muzzle flash. It wasn't panic. It was focus sharp, controlled, almost mechanical. He followed the trail with the caution of a man who had once walked toward danger every day, believing it was his duty. The sun slowly broke through the treetops, casting long, pale rays across the forest. As light revealed more of the path, the blood trail thickened. Drops grew bigger, smeared in directions that suggested whatever creature had left them stumbled, maybe even crawled at times. The forest around him reflected its struggle. Scratches on bark, disturbed leaves, deep impressions in patches of soil. Jack paused occasionally, listening. Nothing. No growl, no movement, no breath but his own. He wondered if he was following something that had already died. Yet something kept him moving forward. A pull, like an invisible thread connecting him to whatever lay at the end of the trail. He told himself it was duty. He was a ranger, first responder, protector of this land. But that explanation didn't feel complete. Something about this morning felt personal, though he couldn't explain why. The trail took him off the familiar paths and into a section of forest where ancient trees rose like pillars, older than any recorded history of human presence. Sunlight barely reached the ground here. A thick layer of needles muffled Jack's steps, making him feel like an intruder in a place where even the air was sacred. Then he saw it. Two massive boulders leaning against each other, forming a natural stone shelter. The blood trail led straight inside. Jack approached slowly, heart pounding harder now. He switched on his flashlight, its beam slicing into the darkness beneath the stones. At first he saw nothing but shadows, then the shadows shifted. A massive shape lay slumped against the inner wall of the stone enclosure. Fur. Limbs too long for a bear, too human in proportion. A broad chest rising and falling with struggling breaths. Jack froze. His brain couldn't categorize what he saw. Every instinct screamed danger, but something in the creature's posture held no threat, only exhaustion. He stepped closer, moving inch by inch. The creature stirred weakly, one heavy arm shifting as though it sensed his presence. Jack's breath caught as the beam of light slid across its face, at once wild and familiar. Deep-set eyes reflecting intelligence, grief, and centuries of fatigue. Fur matted with blood, a massive wound along its side, ragged and deep. This was no animal, and no man. Jack's mind raced, trying to reconcile what stood before him with everything he knew of the natural world. For a moment he wondered if he was hallucinating, if his lingering trauma had finally twisted itself into something visible. But the creature was real. Too real. Its labored breathing echoed softly in the hollow space. Its blood soaked the earth. He lifted both hands slowly, palms out, the way he used to approach wounded civilians overseas. The creature didn't move to attack. It didn't have the strength to. Its eyes followed him, filled with a strange, quiet acceptance. Jack knelt beside it. He felt fear, but it was muted under something stronger, a deep, instinctive empathy. He unzipped his pack and pulled out the first aid kit. "I'm here to help," he whispered, his voice rough from disbelief. The creature blinked slowly, as if acknowledging him. Jack assessed the wound. It was bad, deep, jagged, likely infected, and clearly not inflicted by any natural predator he knew. There was no way this being could survive long. The realization weighed heavily on him, a familiar sinking in his gut. The same helplessness he once felt watching life slip away from people he'd fought beside. He worked methodically, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, wrapping layer upon layer of bandages. The creature flinched occasionally but made no sound. Its endurance was unnerving, almost as if pain was something ancient to it, something it had long ago accepted as a companion. Hours seemed to pass in that quiet stone shelter. Jack barely noticed the time until the creature's breathing became more stable, though still shallow. Then, as Jack adjusted the final bandage, the creature's hand, massive, covered in coarse fur, lifted slowly and touched his arm. Its voice came as a faint rumble, at first unintelligible, then forming words shaped by effort and age. "You came," it said. Jack's breath hitched. His mind struggled to grasp the meaning of what he had just heard. The creature spoke, not in growls, in words. It took a moment before Jack could respond. "I followed the trail. You're hurt. I couldn't leave you." The creature's eyes softened. "Too late," it murmured. "But thank you." Jack wanted to argue, to say he could still help, but one look at the creature's wound told him the truth. This being, whatever it was dying. The creature shifted slightly, as though trying to sit more upright. Its breathing trembled, and for a moment Jack feared it would collapse again. Then it spoke again, voice deeper now, almost resonant. "My name, long ago, was Sentry, the Watcher. I have seen much." Jack felt the weight of that voice settle over him. He listened as the creature, this Watcher, began to tell its story, its words punctuated by labored breaths. It spoke of forests, older than the oldest human towns, of kin that once walked these lands, of their slow disappearance as the world changed. It spoke of mankind, not with hatred, but with a weary understanding that stung deeper than blame. "Humans, not evil," the Watcher whispered. "Just afraid. Always afraid. They destroy what they do not understand, and what they need to survive." Jack listened in stunned silence. This was no myth, no hallucination. This was a dying witness to a century of change, speaking its truth with the last of its strength. The Watcher's voice faded, but it forced one last message through. "You, soldier, ranger, you see death. You know time is short. Tell them. Remember. Plant seeds." It lifted one hand, placing it weakly on Jack's shoulder, a gesture so deliberate, so unmistakably human in intention, that Jack felt tears sting his eyes. Moments later, the creature's breath grew thin, then faded. The massive chest rose one final time, then fell still. Jack sat frozen, staring at the lifeless form. Something inside him, something long shut away, broke open. He bowed his head, grief washing through him in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He didn't know this creature, yet losing it felt like losing a fragment of an older world, a world that had been dying long before he arrived. When he finally moved, it was only to honor the Watcher. He spent hours gathering stones, building a cairn over the body with steady, reverent hands. Each stone felt like an act of penance, a vow, a responsibility placed upon him. When he finished, he stood before the cairn, breathing hard, not from exertion but from the weight of what he had witnessed. In the hush of the forest, he spoke quietly, voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "I remember. I'll tell them. I promise." The forest stirred, a wind brushing through the trees, shifting the canopy as though acknowledging his words. Jack watched the leaves tremble in that brief breeze, and though he knew the forest could not truly answer, he felt something in that moment, a sense that his vow had been heard. As he walked away from the cairn, the forest no longer felt silent in a threatening way. Instead, it felt expectant, watchful, as though the trees themselves waited for him to keep the promise he had made to the last of its ancient guardians. Jack did not know where this path would lead him. He only knew he could not turn back. Not now. Not after what he had seen, and not after what he had heard. The world felt different, bigger, more fragile, more real, and he carried with him the knowledge that his quiet life in the forest was over. A heavier, more meaningful burden had taken its place. He walked toward home as the sun dipped behind the trees, the weight of his promise following him like a shadow that would never again let him rest. Followed the same familiar trails he had walked 1,000 times. The forest no longer seemed like the silent refuge it once was. Every tree felt heavier with meaning. Every patch of moss seemed to carry memory. Every stone along the path felt like part of a world older and more fragile than he had ever realized. He kept seeing the Watcher's last expression, the way the creature had looked at him with weary clarity, as though accepting death not as a tragedy, but as the final obligation of a long and difficult life. Jack felt as though he had stepped into a story he was not prepared to live. When he reached his cabin, dusk had already settled. The faded sky cast a dim glow through the window, illuminating the wooden walls in soft amber. Jack closed the door behind him and leaned against it, eyes closed, letting the quiet cabin absorb the weight of his emotions. He felt hollow and full at the same time. He wanted to speak the Watcher's words out loud, as if doing so might help him understand them, might give them shape, might prevent them from fading like the memory of a dream. Instead, he sat at the table and opened his old field notebook, one he had barely touched in months. He began writing. He wrote everything: the size of the footprints, the smell of the stone enclosure, the depth of the wound, the wisdom in the creature's voice, the exact phrasing of each message the Watcher had strained to say. He wrote until his fingers cramped, until ink smudged down the page, until his handwriting deteriorated into shaky lines from exhaustion. He feared forgetting even a fragment. The creature had asked him to remember, and Jack felt that promise bind itself to him with the weight of a soldier's oath. By the time he looked up from the notebook, night had already thickened outside. He sat there for several minutes, staring at the wall as though it might answer the questions swirling in his mind. What was he supposed to do now? Tell someone? Who would believe him? A ranger claiming he had spoken to an ancient creature of the forest. Even he barely believed it had happened, though the vividness of his memory and the ache in his chest told him otherwise. Sleep eluded him. Instead, he lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the forest outside. The wind rustled through the branches, almost like a whisper, reminding him that he had made a promise. When dawn broke, he rose with a clarity he had not felt in years. The Watcher's final request echoed in his mind, steady and unyielding. Plant seeds. He had no idea how to begin, but he knew he had to try. The first step was understanding, or at least attempting to. Jack headed into the small town near the forest boundary, a place he rarely visited except for supplies. Walking into the library felt strange, almost intrusive. The last time he had been here, he barely remembered. Years ago, perhaps. Now the quiet aisles, the dust-covered shelves, the faint smell of old paper. All of it felt like stepping into another world entirely, one less ancient than the forest, but no less full of stories. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly at her neck, looked up from her desk with surprise. She knew Jack, but only as the ranger who stayed on the outskirts of everyone's life. His presence inside the library seemed unexpected. Still, she greeted him politely, and Jack nodded in return, though speaking felt clumsy. He wandered through the aisles, scanning titles about ecology, climate science, environmental history, forests of the Pacific Northwest. Each book he pulled down seemed to echo fragments of what the Watcher had spoken of: shrinking habitats, temperature changes, disappearing species. Page after page confirmed that the creature had not been recounting myth or fable. It had been describing reality. He read for hours, absorbing information with the same calm intensity he once applied to field reports and mission briefings. The more he learned, the more weight he felt pressing onto his shoulders. Humanity knew the truth. Scientists had been warning for decades, but knowledge had never been enough to stop the harm. People were often willing to destroy what they depended on simply because change frightened them. The Watcher had understood that. Jack wondered if he had understood it before yesterday. By afternoon, Jack closed the final book and realized he could not simply gather evidence for his own understanding. He needed to share it. He needed to speak. But with whom? As he left the library, a familiar voice called his name. It was the schoolteacher, a kind man who occasionally crossed paths with Jack during seasonal events. He asked if Jack could come in the next week to give a talk to the kids about wildlife safety and forest etiquette. Normally, Jack avoided speaking engagements, but today something stirred in him. Children. Young minds. New soil for seeds. "I can do it," Jack said, surprising even himself. The teacher's face brightened, unaware of the deeper acceptance Jack had just made. When the day arrived, Jack stood in front of the small classroom, feeling the same nervous tension he had once felt, before stepping into a helicopter destined for unknown terrain. The children stared at him with wide, curious eyes, some shifting eagerly in their seats, others whispering quietly. He began with simple topics: animal tracks, seasonal dangers, respecting the land. But as the minutes passed, something inside him urged him forward. He paused, glanced toward the windows overlooking the distant tree line, and then told them about the footprints he had found. The forest, the silence, the trail of blood. His voice grew softer as he described finding a dying creature unlike any known species. The children listened with unusual silence, not with fear, but fascination. He didn't tell them everything. Some truths were too heavy. But he told them enough. Enough to plant curiosity. Enough to plant respect. Enough to plant the idea that the world was larger and more fragile than people believed. After the talk, 3 of the older children approached him, eager to learn more. They asked if he could teach them how to identify forest signs, how to track animals, how to understand the land. For the first time in years, Jack saw hope reflected in someone else's eyes. News traveled faster in small towns than wildfire through dry brush. Soon, adults were talking about the ranger's unusual story, some with intrigue, others with skepticism. Some laughed. A few scoffed openly. A couple of the older residents dismissed him as a man who had spent too much time alone in the woods. But others were not so quick to judge. A local environmental volunteer reached out, asking for Jack's insights on forest changes. A biology teacher asked him to visit her class next. A few parents quietly thanked him for getting their children interested in nature again. Yet not all responses were kind. Representatives from a logging company confronted him at a town meeting, accusing him of spreading anti-progress myths. Jack felt their hostility but refused to back down. He wasn't campaigning against their livelihoods. He was trying to explain reality. Still, they saw threat in his words, perhaps even guilt. Then came the night of the town council meeting. It was supposed to be routine discussing zoning issues and trail maintenance, but a new proposal for an aggressive logging expansion had gathered a sizable crowd. Jack sat in the back, planning only to observe. But as residents argued, as some spoke of profits and others of land preservation, Jack felt something inside him shift. A heavy, undeniable sense of responsibility pressed against his ribs. He stood. The room quieted. Jack spoke. Not with the flair of a practiced orator, but with the unvarnished truth of a man who had lived through war, death, silence, and an encounter that had changed him forever. He told them about the footprints, the forest's silence, the wounded creature, the reality described in the books he had read, the warnings scientists had given for decades. He didn't try to convince them about the Watcher specifically. Instead, he spoke about the consequences of continuing without change. He ended simply, "It doesn't matter if you believe in what I saw. What matters is that the things we're losing will not return. Not in our lifetime. Not in our children's. The silence after his words was profound, not hostile, not mocking, just thoughtful. The council postponed the logging decision, and that night, for the first time since the Watcher's death, Jack felt the fragile beginnings of hope. Days passed, then weeks. People he had never spoken to before approached him with questions. A small group of teenagers formed a nature club under supervision of their teachers, with Jack sometimes guiding their excursions into the forest. They picked up trash, cataloged animal sightings, learned to identify plant species. Parents started attending nature walks. A few volunteers joined a local reforestation project. Even some loggers, skeptical at first, expressed interest in alternative methods that would protect old-growth areas. Change came slowly, but it came. One day, Jack received a visit from 2 tribal elders from a community living near the reservation lands. They had heard his story. They told him their people had legends of forest guardians, different names, different descriptions, but the essence was the same. They believed him, not because they had proof, but because ancient memory echoed in his words. They offered guidance, support, and knowledge passed down through generations. Jack felt humbled and less alone. Months later, small victories began to accumulate. A protected grove, a new conservation program, community meetings where environmental voices shared the floor with industry leaders instead of being drowned out. People began listening more carefully. Children asked better questions. Adults considered the long-term consequences more seriously. Jack had not set out to lead anything, yet he found himself at the center of a quiet transformation, a promise kept in action, not in words. A year after the Watcher's death, Jack returned to the cairn he had built beneath the boulders. The forest greeted him with its familiar scent of moss and cedar. He knelt by the stones, resting a hand on them, feeling the smooth edges warmed by the afternoon sun. He spoke softly, not knowing if the forest remembered his voice, but needing to speak anyway. I kept my promise. People are listening. Not everyone. Not always. But enough to matter. The trees swayed in a passing breeze, leaves rustling above him like a gentle acknowledgement. Jack sat there for a long while, watching sunlight shift across the clearing. He no longer felt like a man hiding from the world. He felt like a bridge between what had been lost and what might still be saved. When he finally rose to leave, he looked back once more at the cairn and whispered, "Your seeds are growing." He walked through the forest with a steady resolve. The path ahead would not be easy change, never was, but he knew now that he had the strength to walk it. Not because he was a soldier or a ranger, but because he was a witness, a keeper of a dying truth, a man entrusted with a message, and he intended to carry that message as far as the world would let him. Subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with your friends.